Hi, this is Chris and welcome to today's next step. I call today's next step railroad tracks, and this was a defining moment in my career as a coach, and it has served me and almost every client I've ever worked with since that time has heard this story, to the point that people have come up to me in the airport 5, 10, 15 years later and said, "Hey, do you remember when you talked to me about those railroad tracks?" Yeah, I still do that. So let's talk about railroad tracks. I was in Canada working with some General Motors dealerships as a coach. And there was a 3-person team where we went in, and one person focused on the variable operations, one person focused on the fixed operations, and one person focused on leadership and culture. And I was the leadership and culture person in this team. And we went to this amazing dealership that after 2 days of interviewing frontline and managers, looking at all of their research reports, of going through their financials, of talking to people about their processes and systems. When we finished, I will say to that point in my career, it was hands down the single best dealership I've ever worked with. I'd never seen the ideas of a great culture, of employee engagement, of customer enthusiasm more clearly expressed behaviorally ever. And so we finished our 2 days, we made our report, our recommendations where we thought things could get better. But when we finished all up, everybody's thanking each other and the dealer principal had sat through the whole meeting. We finished up and he was thanking us all, and I stopped him and I said, "May I ask you a question?" And he said, "Sure." I said, "I have learned in life that if there's a garden, there's always a gardener. Gardens don't happen by accident. They're intentional, and there's always a gardener. Weeds happen by themselves. There is no way that this operation you have happened by accident or by magic, and there has to be a story behind it. Would you tell me that story?" And he said, "Chris, you're the first person that's ever asked me." And I said, "I cannot believe people don't want to know your secret and best practices. Oh, they all want to know my secret sauce and my best practices and my processes. You're the first person that ever asked for my story." I said, "Would you tell it to me?" He said, "Sure, buy me dinner," which is great because usually it's the owner that buys the dinner for the consultant. So he was just turning the tables on me. I said, "You got it." He took me to the most expensive steakhouse in town. It's probably like a $250 dinner. It was worth every penny of it and 1,000 times more. So we had this lovely dinner and we got all done. And I said, "You owe me a story." He said, "Okay, Chris, this is it. I was a young hotshot kid, started selling cars when I was 19 years old. By the time I was 21, I was a sales manager. By the time I was 24, I was a general sales manager. By the time I was 27, I was a general manager. And by the time I was 30, I owned a dealership." And he said, "Now I worked hard and I was talented. And I had a lot of breaks and other stuff. I'm not delusional. But like everyone else, when I became a 30-year-old millionaire, I became an idiot. I became arrogant and cruel. And it started to affect every area of my life, but especially my family. And by the time I was 40, I was divorced. My children weren't talking to me. I had this great business, but I had no family. And I did what most 40-year-old multimillionaires did, sex, drugs, rock and roll, everything. I found any way that I could to try and fill that hole, fill that gap, be happy and go through. I had a great team and they were continuing to help run my business, but I was struggling." And he said, "And then I can't explain how or why, but I met the woman that is now my wife. And for whatever reason, she saw a diamond where other people saw coal. And we had this really great time dating. We got married and we were on our honeymoon. And it was the last night of our honeymoon. We were in Hawaii. And because of the time change, I was up at like 5 in the morning, so it was easy to watch the sunrise. And I'm sitting out on the balcony watching the sunrise, realizing that this afternoon I'm going to fly home. And I was seized with fear. What if I do the same thing to her that I did to my last family? I don't know how to make this work. Have you ever had a moment like that in your life where there's something that you wanted so bad and you got it and you had no idea how to preserve it, how to take care of it? This beautiful plot of ground, but you don't know how to garden. So he flew home and he said, we got home and I didn't sleep that night, that whole night. I was up all night wondering what I'm going to do. And he said, I drove into work. And as I'm going into work, I'm still thinking about this and I'm coming home. And he said, as I was coming home that night, about 3 miles from my house is a set of railroad tracks. And my car drove over the railroad tracks. And I was like, oh. And I said, I'm not going to go into my house to see my wife. And then later when I had more kids and my children, until I'm in a frame of mind or a state of mind where I can show up for her and make the first 30 seconds of her day the best 30 seconds of her day. He said, Chris, as he's telling me the story, he said, there were a lot of days that 3 miles wasn't enough. I was so caught up in what was going on at work. I had to drive around the block 3, 4, 5, sometimes 10 or 20 times before I could put myself in a space where I could really show up. Remember in the previous next steps, we've talked about seen, heard, and understood. I could really show up so my wife would feel seen, heard, and understood. The first 30 seconds of her day would be the best 30 seconds of her day. Then, as that started to groove in and I watched what it did, I thought, I drive to work every day. So 3 miles out, hit the railroad tracks. I have 20 miles till I get to work. I started turning off the radio and all the other stuff, and I would just think through my day. Who am I going to meet today? Who am I going to see? And how can I find a way to make sure that the first 30 seconds they have with me are the best 30 seconds of their day? Now that caused me to be far more focused and far more, you would say, like Disney would say, on stage than I ever thought I would need to be. But it changed my business. That's how we got all those results that you were talking about and that you see. And I thanked him. I said, this is absolutely brilliant. And I went home, and the first thing I said is, what's my railroad track? And that's what I'm going to ask you to think about. Going home today, what is your railroad track? What can you set up so that you know it's time to flip the switch and say, how can I show up and make sure the first 30 seconds that my family has with me is the best 30 seconds of their day? And then coming into work, how can you make sure at the key meetings, those key elements, those key phone calls, that boom, the first 30 seconds is the best 30 seconds of their day because they were with you. And that is the power of railroad tracks. So I'm going to ask you to sit down and look at what is your going home railroad track, what is your going to work railroad track, and how can you start to practice step by step, day by day, person by person, showing up so the first 30 seconds someone has with you is the best 30 seconds of their day. And that is the next step for today.